This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. As always, I am Jason Jarvi. Welcome back. I'm glad you came. Are you ready to talk some fantasy football? We still have well over 3 months until opening day, but it's never too early to really start diving into fantasy football, as we have in the past couple weeks. So I'm going to start off with some NFL news that might affect us in fantasy land. First off, the Jacksonville Jaguars, they ponied up a bunch of cash and gave wide receiver Allen Hurns an extension that has a base value right now of $40 million. So it's definitely well-deserved. Last year, he had 64 passes, He caught 64 passes for over 1,000 yards and had 10 touchdowns. But you got to remember, they also have the other Allen on their team, Allen Robinson. And the one thing that does worry me is you always see players who they go out, they get a bunch of money, and then they just don't perform. That you want to see. It's better to have a guy in their contract year, because then they have some incentive to really go out and try and get that money. But now with him, he's already got the extension. You just got to hope that he's got the drive in him, that he's going to work for it. I still see Hurns. He's going to have a decent year. I really see Allen Robinson as the top wide receiver, but that whole Jaguars offense is starting to come together with Robinson and Hurns and TJ Yeldon in the backfield, and Blake Bortles really becoming a top quarterback in the NFL. So I wouldn't put too much worry on him, but I wouldn't be too surprised if he did have a slightly down year this year. And I know I feel like we can't go a week without talking about Tom Brady, because it really will affect you in the beginning of the season and where you draft him going into the season, because if he's suspended the first 4 weeks of the season, his value drops, because you really can't lose a season. But if you start off the first 4 games, you go 0-4 or 1-3, you're in a pretty deep hole. So this week, a renowned arbitrator, Kenneth Feinberg, filed an 8-page submission to the courts, fighting for Tom Brady. So really, as I said last week, Brady's going to get out of this. You still are going to have to watch it, but Tom Brady, he's more than likely not going to be serving any time, or if anything, it's going to be pushed off until next season. And really, next season, worry about it next season. I think Tom Brady, you're going to have him for your full slate of games this year. In San Francisco, quarterback Colin Kaepernick, he's been in off-season workouts, but he has been missing some time. He's had a couple off-season surgeries on his shoulder, on his thumb, and his knee, and he's not fully participating. So it does worry me a little bit. I know that he's had his troubles outside of injuries, because he hasn't wanted to be there, but now he wants to be there. And I think it's an open competition at the moment between him and Blaine Gabbert. And we've seen from Colin Kaepernick before that he has the ability to be a pretty solid quarterback. I know there's questions about his decision making and his accuracy, but I think when Chip Kelly went to San Francisco, I really thought it was kind of a perfect fit for Colin Kaepernick. He's more of a mobile quarterback, and I know he probably wants to focus more on using his arm. But I think in a system like Chip Kelly's, it's really designed for that mobile quarterback. And I think Kelly could get the most out of Kaepernick. He may just not have been as open to it now. I'm going to really watch and see what happens there in San Francisco, because Kaepernick, it would be kind of sneaky to see him, come out this season and actually be a pretty solid quarterback. And, in Philadelphia, they didn't have the quarterback that really fit Chip Kelly's up-tempo offense. I think Cap could run that offense the way that Kelly used to run it in Oregon. But first off, Kaepernick is going to have to get back on the field, and then he's going to have to beat out Blaine Gabbert for the starting job. In Washington, as we've said before, Deshaun Jackson has been missing some of the OTAs, and now Josh Doxson, the wide receiver that they draft in the first round, he's sidelined at the moment with a foot injury that they're not thinking is too serious. But they went out and they signed another rookie receiver to really help fill out the team. Now, the longer that Deshaun Jackson isn't on the team, it's hurting him even more. It's more time that he's away from the team, and we talked about it last week that he's going to be fighting for a contract at the end of the season. And that's even if he is with the team by the end of the season. And if he really did want to continue his career there in Washington, it would behoove him to get into camp and start just show your face. And that's all we really want. That's you hurt fantasy owners by not putting yourself out there, not going through OTAs, because you're not sure what you're going to get from him. I think so. Probably if he's still absent by the time draft comes around, it's gonna drop him at least 2 to 3 rounds, and who knows what effects that could even have in him in the later parts of it, because we've seen before when guys miss OTAs or have any holdouts that they come in, they're rusty, and they do tend to get injured, which we'll just have to keep an eye on it. And then finally, again, it's not a whole lot of news out there, but this is probably one of the bigger ones besides Tom Brady. Involves another quarterback, Ryan Fitzpatrick. And it seems like the Jets and Fitzpatrick are still just far apart in terms of contract talk. And it's not good for the Jets, and it's not good for Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker. I know they sat out the beginning of OTAs as kind of a, to stand in arms with their brother, but they're back in camp, that's all that the Jets really care about. And I think the Jets may be in a standoff right now with Fitzpatrick, and I think Fitzpatrick doesn't want to end his career right now, and there really isn't any other team out there that is going to give him the kind of money or the chance that he's going to get with the Jets. So it's going to come down to a matter of the Jets want Ryan Fitzpatrick to be their quarterback. They don't want Geno Smith to start this season at all. And Ryan Fitzpatrick is going to want to be there. And I think something's going to give. And I think they're probably sometime in June, maybe early July at the latest, you're going to see them come to terms. They're going to find a happy medium. It might be a 1-year deal. It might be a 2-year deal. But they're going to get the deal done because the Jets, they had a pretty decent season last season. And I think with just a little bit more push, I think they could be in the playoffs next season and really pushing the AFC, because they do have some special players on there. That's it for news. Now we're going to go to the segment there where I've been going around the league. I've been previewing the different conferences and the divisions, telling you the teams that you need to be looking at. I've gone through the AFC and the NFC North. So now I'm going to move to the South this week. I'm going to be covering the NFC South. And we'll start with the team who won the division. They looked unstoppable, but they just ran into an immovable force in the Super Bowl. And that is the Carolina Panthers. And surprisingly enough, they do have some really good talent fantasy-wise. Cam Newton last season, he had an MVP, NFL, and fantasy-wise season. And my worry would be that I just don't see him being able to recreate it the way that he had. I think he had some really gigantic games. Looking at his stats, he was slightly above his passing yards per season. And it definitely helped that he had his lowest interception total of his career. And the one place where you see the difference is his rushing touchdowns, which they've been going down since his rookie season. They spiked back up to 10 touchdowns last season, and he broke his passing touchdown season total by 11. So he had 35 passing touchdowns and 10 rushing touchdowns, accounting for 45 touchdowns just by himself. So he was far and away the highest scoring quarterback of last season. And he's proven that he's a top 5 quarterback regardless, because going into the beginning of last season, going to drafts, when Kelvin Benjamin went down, I think people really didn't think he'd be able to continue on the streak, because at first he'd always had Steve Smith, and then when he had Kelvin Benjamin, with him going down, he was going to be relying on Ted Ginn and Philly Brown and rookie Devin Funchess, but he made it work. So I think the numbers are going to fall off somewhere. I don't think they're going to fall drastically, but I think he'll be coming down to earth this season, and he'll be a top 5. Somewhere in the top 10, more than likely in the top 5 of quarterbacks. At running back, Jonathan Stewart, he had his best season since 2009, and not a surprise, it was his first full season without D'Angelo Williams. They were, for the longest time, it was a running back by committee, and I think there was no animosity between them, but Stewart, He finally got the bulk of the carries, and even though he still missed 3 games, which really that's his MO, he had a decent season. The one thing that I really don't like about Jonathan Stewart, he's not really a receiving threat. He's not gonna fool anybody. If he's in the backfield, he's gonna be there for running or run support. He's not like a Devontae Freeman or a running back who's a threat out of the backfield. Last year he really benefited from Cam's big season. Because Cam, he had 10 of the rushing touchdowns. He had 10 rushing touchdowns. He had more than Stewart himself. So I think Stewart, he's 29 right now, and you've probably seen the best that he's going to give. But I really still see him as a low-end running back 2 or a flex play. He definitely still has upside. And you look at what he was getting last season, and he was regularly getting 20 carries. They were rounding and pounding on with their offense, relying on that big offensive line. So I think Stewart, he'll still have a decent season, but I wouldn't want to rely on him as your number 1 running back. The other running backs there, Fozzie Whitaker and Cameron Artis-Payne, they don't really have a ton of value. The games that Stewart missed, they were serviceable, but they didn't run as hard as Stewart. And I think what you'll see is if Jonathan Stewart is hurt or he's not in the game, then Cam Newton is gonna figure out a way to win. He's not gonna rely on Cameron Artis-Payne to win a game. He's gonna throw or he's gonna run it himself. So I'd be really hard pressed to draft one of those guys. And the only reason that you really would want to draft him is if you have Jonathan Stewart and, I don't know, maybe late in your draft, you want to get a handcuff. That would be the only way that I would draft one of those guys. Last season with no Kelvin Benjamin, Cam Newton, he really got creative spreading the ball around. And another guy that kind of came, he rose from the ashes, Ted Ginn Jr., he was probably, besides Greg Olsen, was the biggest benefactor last year. He had one of his best seasons, and he caught 10 touchdowns, which, unfortunately, Kelvin Benjamin isn't going to stay hurt forever. So with Benjamin back this year, Ted Ginn he's going to go back to second fiddle. And those 10 touchdowns, I would cut that in half. And because there's so much going on in that offense that there really just won't be enough for Kelvin Benjamin and Greg Olsen and Cam Newton and Ted Ginn Jr. to get his touchdowns. So where Ted Ginn was almost a borderline wide receiver 1 last season, he immediately for me goes down to low end wide receiver 3 to, maybe a flex play. And it's unfortunate, but he is getting older, and they do have talent in their wide receiver core. As I said, Kelvin Benjamin, he's coming back, and as long as he's healthy, he's going to return to what he was, and he's going to be a top 15 wide receiver. He has that ability. I think you're going to want to wait. I'm not sure if he's going to be move into that top 10, that upper echelon of wide receivers, just because of the way that offense is run. But he's going to be he's a low-end wide receiver 1. The other guys there, as I mentioned, Corey Brown, Devin Funchess, they're going to have a game here and there. And I like what Devin Funchess, coming into last year, he was a raw product. Coming out of Michigan, he was more seen as he was a big tight end that kind of converted to a receiver. He's more of a Jimmy Graham type, but he's really embraced the receiver role more than him. And both of those guys, Corey Brown and Funchess, they're going to have a game here or there, but like most offenses where you see that they just spread the ball around way too... Wait, I'm not saying it's bad that they spread the ball around, but fantasy-wise, it gives us headaches because you just have to guess and figure out who is going to have that good game. So they don't have a ton of value other than late in the draft if you're looking for depth. Their tight end, Greg Olsen, he is one of the top tight ends. He's extremely dependable. And Newton always just seems to find him. Watching Panther games last season, it always just seemed that if a play was broken, he was going to find Greg Olsen, and Olsen caught the pass. So Olsen is one of the best, and he really can change games for you. And the only tight end who I really think is better than him is obviously Rob Gronkowski. But you can make an argument that Greg Olsen is a pretty close number 2. The only way that I wouldn't take, obviously, you're not taking Greg Olsen over Rob Gronkowski in drafts, but I don't see much of a drop-off for Greg Olsen this year in drafts. So to recap the Panthers, Cam Newton, he's a top 5 quarterback this season, and he definitely has the potential to be a top quarterback. But I'd look somewhere in the 4th round for him because you're still going to want to go before him with your dependable guys, with your Aaron Rodgers. And, after Aaron Rodgers, maybe Tom Brady, Cam Newton really should be starting to get talked about then after that. Jonathan Stewart, I would start looking somewhere in the 5th or 6th. And I would be wary of his age, and if he'll start breaking down even more this season. He really did seem like he started to gain speed late in the season, so that could be a good sign, but keep an eye on him. As for Fozzie Whitaker and Cameron Artis-Payne, I really wouldn't draft those guys. And if Jonathan Stewart does go down in the season at some point, there's more than likely a better replacement on the waiver wire than either of those two guys. Kelvin Benjamin, I'd look somewhere in the 3rd or 4th round. He's going to be, as I said, a top 15 wide receiver, and I think wide receivers people are going to go wide receiver heavy this year. Ted Ginn Jr., I know somebody's going to reach for him. I don't want to be that guy. I would start looking Ted Ginn Jr. somewhere in the mid rounds of the draft. And for Corey Brown and Devin Funchess, I would either leave them until really late in the draft or just let them go undrafted. And for Greg Olsen, his value has really gone up. I'd say somewhere late 5th, 6th round. But just make sure that you're solid with the other picks at that point, because that could be one of the issues you run into, and that's something that I've ran into before in drafts, where I try to reach for that really good tight end, and I've been burned. You want to make sure that you're solid with the top 5 picks, that you know you're going to be set for the season with those guys, then take your reach on your tight end. Next team up in the NFC South, the Atlanta Falcons. They had a strong start, started the season 6-1, but finished it at 8-8. That's some Detroit Lions stuff. You start that good and you finish 500. That's not good, man. Matt Ryan, it all looks better on paper, but then you see that they finished 8-8, and you're not sure what went really wrong with them. Matt Ryan, he had an okay season last year, but that's really the best that we can come to really expect from Matt Ryan is an okay season. I know early in his career he had some higher expectations. I mean, myself included. I depended my season at one point on Matt Ryan, and totally burned me. But this season, you're going to expect he's going to throw somewhere around 4,500 yards. He's going to get somewhere around 20 or so touchdowns, and he's going to throw double-digit interceptions. He's a really, really good backup fantasy quarterback. He's not somebody you want to rely on to win you games, but he's good to have on your bench for bye weeks, or if your quarterback does go down, because in a pinch, Matt Ryan can fill in and be a really solid fantasy quarterback. At running back, they have one of the best young running backs that I've seen in a while, and I'm jumping on the bandwagon. Devontae Freeman, he was, aside from him and Julio Jones, they were really the bright spots on the team last season. Tevin Coleman, the rookie last year, he came out, he won the job initially, got hurt, and Devontae Freeman had just a tear. He had 4 monster weeks, which, I mean, if you had to go up against Devontae Freeman in those weeks where he was scoring over 30 points, I feel bad for you, because it came out of nowhere. Devontae Freeman was a really late draft pick, or he was more than likely a waiver wire pickup for most people last season. Freeman, he really cemented himself, I think, as a top 10 fantasy back in the league. And as I said, he had the 4 monster weeks, and that really helped him in the long run. He did kind of, he was hindered by an injury at mid-season, and his production went down. But as soon as they kind of gave him the green light to go, he came back, and he was a pretty dependable back. I wouldn't be surprised to see him backslide a little, but I think the potential is there for him, and I think the potential is greater that he's going to be even better this season. With the games that he was hindered by his injury, if he was healthy at that point, I think he could have even had a better season. There's no other running. Tevin Coleman, he'll be a nice change of pace back, but I think he's nothing more than a handcuff at this point. And if Freeman does go down, Coleman will definitely benefit, but I don't think he's not as good as Freeman. Freeman did everything. He ran the ball and he caught the ball. And Coleman, you should draft him if you go out in the first or second round and you draft Devontae Freeman. But Tevin Coleman with Freeman in there, Coleman has really no value. But draft him. And as I said earlier, the bright spots for the Falcons last season, Julio Jones was the other bright spot, and he got all these stats despite the team's 8-8 record, and it kind of reminded me of what Calvin Johnson used to do here in Detroit, where he comes out and he has this gigantic season, but the team is still garbage. Looking at his stats from last year, he had 24 more catches than Falcon wide receivers. That's all Falcon wide receivers put together. He had 24 more catches than all Falcon wide receivers. When he's healthy, Julio Jones is one of the best wide receivers in the league. Now, you have Antonio Brown, who was he's been a monster for the past 2 years. And then you have some Odell Beckhams and DeAndre Hopkins, but I think Julio Jones can really make a name for himself, and I think he's probably the number 2 wide receiver in the league, because he catches everything that comes to him, and he finds the end zone. He just finds a way to do it. So as long as he's healthy, which that has been one of his issues, he's going to be a dependable wide receiver that's going to carry your team at times. The Falcons went out and signed free agent wide receiver Mohamed Sanu, and he's going to be their number 2 guy right now. But I see him maxing out somewhere around 800 yards and 4 to 5 touchdowns, and that's truly maxing out with what Matt Ryan does and what he's able to. He's another guy who spreads the ball around, and they do benefit from having Devontae Freeman, a pass-catching running back. Sanu he's not going to be a number 1 wide receiver ever. He wasn't that in Cincinnati, and he's not going to be that here in Atlanta. If Julio Jones does go down, he might see a little uptick, but I really see them leaning more on Devontae Freeman at that point. The only other relevant wide receiver on the Falcons is Justin Hardy, but I would consider either waiting until the last rounds to draft him or just let him be on the waiver wire. And at tight end, Jacob Tamme was okay, but there's way other better options out there. You don't have to read there. He's a name. He's been around for a while, but I wouldn't advise drafting him. Let him stay in the waiver wire. If somebody goes down, then go pick up Jacob Tamme. So to recap the Falcons, Matt Ryan, I would see drafting him somewhere in the mid to late rounds. If you got an injury-prone quarterback, or maybe if you got one of the lower top 10 quarterbacks, I'd jump up a little bit higher to get Matt Ryan, so you do have that safety net that if something doesn't go wrong, or if the luck of the draw doesn't work on the quarterback you picked, Matt Ryan is a pretty dependable backup. Devontae Freeman, he's likely going to go in the middle part of the first round. I know I've seen him rated as somewhere between the 5th and 8th best running back in a lot of rankings, but I think he has the possibility, and I think he could be one of the top picks this year. Julio Jones, I see him definitely going. If you see him anywhere past the second round, you need to draft him at that point. Julio Jones shouldn't make it out of the middle part of the second round because he's just that good. I wouldn't be surprised to see somebody reaching for him at the end of the first round, depending on how big your league is. Mohamed Sanu, he's a mid to late round pick. He's not much more than a flex play, and the rest of the guys on that team, unless you're going to go Tevin Coleman somewhere late in the draft. It's likely they're going to go undrafted. Going to take a quick break right now. When I come back, I'll finish up the rest of the NFC South, and then we have some fantasy football prep I'll go over, and I'll give you the King's Decree. But you're listening to the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get the latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is coming soon. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more, and follow them on Twitter at FanUpNetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerd Show. We're going to wrap up the Around the NFL segment. We still have 2 more teams to go on. The next team in the division is the New Orleans Saints. Then they really had a disappointing season that could have swung either way. They finished 7-9, but even still, Drew Brees still was pretty impressive. He's getting older, but he finished as a top 10 quarterback. Even though he's getting up there in age, I really still see him having a few good years in him. His yards have declined, but you also saw him last year. He didn't have Jimmy Graham, so there's still enough weapons around him. He made Ben Watson into a really top tight end last season, and I think he has better options really this season. Starting with Mark Ingram at running back, he was having a solid season last year, but he missed the last 4 games, which it's really always been an issue for Ingram. If he can stay healthy, he has the ability to be a pretty decent running back 2 option, but I wouldn't want to rely on him being that number 1 option at running back. You want to have a more dependable guy there. And if you do have to rely on Mark Ingram, then I would hope that you have some pretty strong wide receivers to back him up. The other guys at running back, they have the same guys. Tim Hightower came out of relatively nowhere, and he was okay in spots. And the ghost of CJ Spiller, the guy who had 1 good season, and now all he really is a pass catching running back. Now those guys, they're decent at backup, but you can stash them as depth on your team. But I'd really look for them more in the later rounds. CJ Spiller has a little bit more value in a PPR league, but if you're just talking a standard league, Spiller and Hightower don't have a ton of value other than just depth on your team. A wide receiver, Brandon Cooks, he started to come on late last year. I kind of looked at it. I think they expected a lot more out of him, especially with no Jimmy Graham last season. You expected Brandon Cooks to really step up. And not saying he didn't have a good season. I don't think he was what the Saints thought he was going to be. And a big thing going against him is that he's really dependent on big plays. So the boom or bust makes him a high-end wide receiver 2 for me. He's not yet at that level where I can say he's definitely a number 1 wide receiver. There's too many variables, and especially with an aging Drew Brees, he might lose something on his arm, and he's gonna have a good season, but at most I don't really want to depend on him as more than a wide receiver 2. The other guys that were there last season, Brandon Coleman and Willie Snead, just like always for New Orleans wide receivers, they're gonna have their games, but just like on most teams where the quarterback is really good at spreading the ball around, it's going to be hard to predict which one of those guys is going to have the better game. I think I give an edge more to Willie Snead over Brandon Coleman just because I think he's done it a little bit more. Brandon Coleman, he has the size, but I don't think he has the trust of Drew Brees yet. And as a sleeper, I mentioned him back when we were talking about rookies. I really like Michael Thomas, the guy that they drafted out of Ohio State. They drafted him pretty high. He's not a first rounder, but this is, again, Drew Brees is going to be without one of his most dependable targets in Marcus Colston. And I think they kind of see Michael Thomas as that large red zone threat that Marcus Colston gave you. So I would keep an eye on him, but unless he starts, wowing some people, look for him later in drafts. At tight end last season, Josh Hill, they talked him up so much, and he was supposed to replace Jimmy Graham, and he just completely failed. Ben Watson was there, he stepped in, and Watson had a really awesome season last year. But unfortunately, it looks like the Saints don't have a whole lot of faith in Josh Hill. With Ben Watson gone, they went out and signed free agent tight end Coby Fleener, who's been dependable for Andrew Luck as long as he's been in the league. And if I'm going to pick a sleeper tight end this season, I'm not sure if it's a huge sleeper, but I see Coby Fleener getting a huge boost in his production. You saw what Brees was able to do for Ben Watson, and I see Ben Watson is going to have a rough go of it this year in Baltimore. I think Coby Fleener is going to flourish, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him have a 70, 80 reception season, over 1,000 yards, and somewhere close to 10 touchdowns. I could be crazy. But it's just from watching what the Saints do and how that offense operates. They love tight ends, and Coby Fleener is a big, fast tight end who I think he's just going to fit into that offense. So to recap the Saints, I would start looking for Drew Brees somewhere in the 5th or 6th rounds. Let all the big guys go first. I think he's going to kind of get the Peyton Manning treatment of last year, where he's starting to get up there in age. You start to see a little breakdown in his physicality, but he's still got the ability. He's definitely better than Manning was last year, too. Mark Ingram, you're going to start seeing him go somewhere in the later part of the second. I don't want to put him in the first round yet because I think there's too many good players out there that I would want to take before Mark Ingram. Of running backs, all the top running backs, and then you throw in the top wide receivers like Antonio Brown and DeAndre Hopkins and Odell Beckham. Those are all guys who I'd want to take before Ingram. So I think somewhere in the later part of the second round, more than likely in the third round, is where you'll see Mark Ingram start to go. Brandon Cooks, I see him going somewhere in the 4th round. As I said, he's really dependent on the boom or bust plays. And he's going to burn you some weeks, but then the weeks where he does have 5 receptions for 150 yards and a touchdown, you're going to love him, and he's going to be great for you. So somewhere in the 4th, maybe the 5th round for Brandon Cooks. The other wide receivers on the team, I would look somewhere in the mid to late rounds. They make some pretty decent depth plays later in your draft. And I think Coby Fleener, he is high on a lot of rankings. He's going to go somewhere in the middle rounds. And if you're tight ends, I would wait on Coby Fleener and let him drop. And then, if your team is already stacked at that point, go for Coby Fleener. The other running backs, as I said, Tim Hightower doesn't have a whole lot of value to draft. And C.J. Spiller, I would only really draft him in PPR situations. So the final team in the NFC South, at the cellar, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they finished 6-10, but it's a team that I really kind of saw as trending upwards. And the main reason for that trend is their quarterback, Jameis Winston. Last season he had a bumpy start, but he ended up finishing in the top 15 of scoring for quarterbacks. And, with another offseason under his belt, he's going to become a pretty solid quarterback. And last week during the King's Decree, I predicted him that he's going to be a top 8 quarterback, and he does have that potential. He's a number 1 overall draft pick for a reason, and you saw that he developed later in the season. And a thing that he does have going for him is that the NFC South just always seems to be up for grabs, so that's going to be good for him. Another good thing that helps Jameis Winston is running back Doug Martin, who essentially he returned from the grave last year. He returned to form. Everyone really just thought he was an irrelevant running back. He dropped in drafts last season, but he really proved that he's still around. The muscle hamster lives. So the difficult thing you're going to have with him this year, though, is that he's now had 2 seasons of 1,400 plus yards and 2 seasons of around 400 yards. So I think in those rough seasons that he had, he didn't have a quarterback to really back him up. I think teams were able to stack the box and keep him contained. I know one of those seasons he was hurt for a while, but I think with Jameis Winston as a dependable quarterback, Doug Martin is, at the very least, he's a 1,000-yard rusher who's going to get you somewhere between 6 and 10 touchdowns. So his value is going to go up this year. If you're lucky at all in a keeper league where you drafted him really low, I would really consider taking Doug Martin. The other running back on the team, there's a couple. Charles Sims, I think, is his main backup right now. But his only real value is in PPR leagues. Otherwise, he's just a handcuff, and kind of similar to with Jonathan Stewart. If Doug Martin does go down, there's more than likely going to be a better option on the waiver wire for you to pick up other than Charles Sims. Especially if you aren't in a PPR league, Sims loses all that value. At wide receiver, Mike Evans, he clearly showed he was the number 1 option there. He had a slow start last year. He was definitely battling an injury, but he came around mid-season, around the 7th week, and that was all. It coincided with when Jameis Winston just kind of started getting it together. Mike Evans, he's a low-end wide receiver 1. I would rather, in a perfect world, I would much rather have him as my number 2 wide receiver, because last season he really didn't find the end zone. And if he wants to make a better name for himself and climb up draft boards, he's going to have to find the end zone more, just to get him that value. The good wide receivers find the end zone. Vincent Jackson, last year, he had a down year, but he's still around. He's getting up there in age. I think his value is going to still drop, but I think he's still going to have a couple games here and there where he's going to surprise some people. I would look at him as a low-end wide receiver 3, possibly a flex play, but he's definitely a solid depth to have on your team, and he's a name to have. Mid-season, if you're trying to make a trade, Vincent Jackson may be a pretty solid guy that you throw into your offer, and maybe it gets you that key piece that you need to win your season. The other wide receivers there, Adam Humphries and Lewis Murphy, like most 3rd and 4th wide receivers, they're going to have a game here or there. You saw both of those guys had like a touchdown or a 2 touchdown game, but they don't have a ton of value. I'm not sure if I'm going to draft those guys. At tight end, Austin Seferian-Jenkins, he's played 16 games in 2 seasons, but in those 16 games, which is I guess a full season, he has 40 catches, 550 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So if somehow he can figure out how to stay healthy, he could have some value. If he were to play a full 16-game season in an offense that Jameis Winston is continuing to learn. Mike Evans is a solid producer. Doug Martin is a solid producer. Austin Seferian-Jenkins has the ability to be a top 10 tight end, but it's all going to depend on his health, and more than likely he's just going to end up being a backup tight end for you. So to recap the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Jameis Winston, as much as I think he's going to be a top 8 quarterback, you're going to be able to wait on him in drafts this season. So I'd look somewhere in the middle to late rounds. Doug Martin, I think he could go as high as the first round, but I'd rather see him in the second round. There's probably some wide receivers that I would rather have over Doug Martin. Mike Evans, I think you'll see him go in the late third, early fourth rounds. And Vincent Jackson, I think he's somewhere in the mid to pushing on the late round picks just because he's getting up there in age. And I think they're slowly kind of phasing him out of that offense. And then Seferian-Jenkins, if you could promise me that he's going to be healthy, I would say draft him as a backup tight end. But other than that, I think, other than a very last round pick, I would let him stay. He's going to be on the waiver wire. And, once he has a game, then go out and pick him up and stash him on your team. So I'm going to give you some fantasy prep right now. There isn't a ton you can do, but there is stuff you can do to tweak your league. So this fantasy prep segment, I'm going to focus on picking a name for your team. It's not a huge deal, but there's a lot that goes into a team name. And you don't just want to you don't want to have the ESPN standard, team insert last name and have it be Team Macaroon or Team Jarvi. Put a little thought into it and have fun. I know in one league I was going up against my sister-in-law. So my team name was Bangin' Lisa's Sister, which it was accurate, and we were married, obviously. Everything is okay, but it's funny. So, there's different routes you can go. One of the most famous ones is trying to do a football pun as a name. With Rob Gronkowski, you can do Gronky Punch. And probably one of the most famous is Somewhere Over the Dwayne Bowe. It's very corny, but that's at the very least, I think you can look at that. If you're a Detroit Lion fan, I know a buddy of mine, his team name was Stafford Infection, which it almost sounds like a real infection because I love Matt Stafford so much. Another good route to go for team names, TV and movie references. I've gotten a lot of my team names from there. The team that I won with last year, it was Los Pollos Hermanos, which was the fast food chicken restaurant from Breaking Bad. And I'll always forever love them now because I won the championship with them. But some of the other favorites that I've seen in leagues that I've been in, I was the dark side from Star Wars. Easy Company, which is from Band of Brothers. Death from Above, which is one of the nicknames for Drago and Rocky. And another one, probably one that my brother Joel Jarvi is fond of, is Fat Jesus. He won his championship as Fat Jesus. And a good way to do for leagues is have a theme when you're all naming your team. We've been doing it for a couple years. The first we let the reigning champ of the league pick the theme. So far in the times that we've done it, the first year we did The Great Outdoors, the movie. We had references to that. And then last year we were all minor league baseball teams. So we were able to go out. I was the Tennessee Smokies. I was able to go out and get a Smokies hat and rep my team. I know it's only an imaginary team, and you might be taking a little overboard, but you can go overboard with fantasy. So my biggest thing with picking your team name is to just have fun with it. Don't be stale. So now it's time to wrap up the show. And I'm going to end it as I have the past couple weeks with the King's Decree. As I've done in weeks past, I'm going to give you a bunch of bold predictions on this show, and we'll check back later in the season to see just how right I was, or, unfortunately, how wrong I was. And my prediction, my decree this week, it goes along with a team that I focused on in the Falcons. And my decree this year is Devonta Freeman is going to be the top back again for the second year in a row. I think he has extremely high-end potential. I think at the high end of what he could be, I'm talking Marshall Faulk. Now, you can don't swerve off the road. Don't spit out all your stuff. I'm not calling him Marshall Faulk right now. I'm saying at the top part of his potential, I think there is the possibility that he could have stats like him. But more than likely, I see him more like a Brian Westbrook, who Westbrook had some really solid seasons, also injury prone, as we've seen from Devonta Freeman. But from what Devonta Freeman brings is he's a really dependable ground and pound running back, but he also gives you that threat as a pass catching running back. So, with last year, he had over 1,000 yards rushing, and then he followed up with 73 catches and 500 plus receiving yards last year. If he can, and he had a couple of games there where he just wasn't himself. He had a nagging injury. If he can go a full 16 games, Devonta Freeman has the ability to be the top running back, and he's very young in his career. This could be the start of Devonta Freeman being the next. I'm not calling him Adrian Peterson, but being at the top of the fantasy draft boards. And at the end of the season, I think we're seeing this next round of top backs. It was for a while it was Adrian Peterson, Jamal Charles, and you go back to the LaDainian Tomlinsons, and you just rotate all these names of who's going to be the top back. I think it's going to start to be between Devonta Freeman, Todd Gurley, and if Le'Veon Bell can stay healthy, it's going to be those are your new top three running backs in the NFL fantasy wise. So Devonta Freeman, my prediction, he's going to be the top back once again in 2016, and that is the King's Decree. That's going to do it for this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. I thank you all for tuning in, chatting some fantasy football with me. I hope you enjoyed the show. Next week, we'll go to the other conference, and we'll cover the AFC South. I'll have another prediction. I'll have some more news. But thanks for joining me. You've been listening to the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. Thanks. I'll see you next week.